Good day. Thank you for joining Black Agenda Report. Today we're discussing the aftermath of a June 8th knife attack, which took place in Belfast, Northern Ireland in the UK. The stabbing was caught on video. The assailant was an African asylum seeker and the victim was a local white resident. Bystanders subdued the attacker and the stabbing was very severe, so much so that the victim lost sight in one eye. But in the following days, mobs of white men began attacking Black and brown migrants, setting fire to their homes, and families had to literally flee for their lives. People here in the US, like Elon Musk, played a large role in inflaming the situation and stoking violence. Our guest will provide analysis of these events. Roger McKenzie is the international editor of the UK-based Morning Star, the only English-language socialist daily newspaper in the world. He joins us from Oxford to discuss this incident and what it tells us about politics and racism in Britain. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
You know, Roger, this whole thing. Well, first of all, I just want to say it was an awful thing. For this attack was quite brutal, very shocking, but it set off a wave of violence against Black people, particularly, and I understand Black and brown people in Belfast have been harassed quite even before this happened. Talk to us about that history and about what it says.
Well, I mean, first of all, we must send our thoughts, I think, to the family of Mr. Ogilvie, who was horribly attacked. I mean, you're right, Margaret. I mean, it was really horrible what happened there. We can see that from the film that was taken from the incident. The fact of the matter is that these attacks on Black and brown communities in Northern Ireland have been going on for some time. One of the things that I've written about in the Morning Star over the last couple of years is the attacks that have been taking place on, for example, Black people who work for the National Health Service in Northern Ireland. And actually, without their contribution, there wouldn't be a National Health Service in Northern Ireland. Frankly, there wouldn't be a National Health Service anywhere in Britain without it. I know these are weird and wonderful things to people in the US, this whole talk about a National Health Service, but for us, this is really, really one of the real jewel in the crown of what we provide. And frankly, as I said, it wouldn't be provided without people migrating to the country. Now, what we've seen in some hospitals, one, I think, I might be wrong on this, but I think one was in Belfast, but certainly in Northern Ireland, was things got so bad for some Black people that they actually couldn't live in their homes. They were kind of staying in a condemned bit of the hospital. And I remember writing about this a year or so ago now, and it was really quite frightening to me as somebody who used to represent people who worked in the health service to think that this was actually going on, that people were so scared about going back to their homes, were actually being driven out of communities by racists. So what we saw last week was not new, unfortunately, to a lot of people, because this is something that's been going on for some time. What was different about last week's was the ferocity of it, and the fact that it had clearly been stoked up by, as you say, the likes of Musk. There's also another character called Nigel Farage, who runs Reform UK, and there's a guy called, who's got many names, but one of his names is Tommy Robinson, and all of these people have been stoking up these sort of racist attacks for some considerable time in Northern Ireland, but they've also been stoking it up across in England and Wales and Scotland as well. So what we saw last week were not just demonstrations in Northern Ireland, well, racist rioting in Northern Ireland. What we also saw was people from the far right on the march in Glasgow, for example, and in Edinburgh, because one of the little lies that they passed around, Margaret, was the idea that the person who got attacked was Scottish, which he wasn't. He was Irish. But the far right in Glasgow were saying, well, he's one of ours, and therefore we have to kick all these people out. And that's how quickly these lies spread around social media. So this is not new. We also saw, I should say, as well, in Southampton recently, where there was attacks taking place on migrants just walking down the road, minding their own business, but they were attacked because of another attack that had taken place in Southampton as well. So these things are being stoked up by the far right very deliberately, and the level of communication that they've got to get these people, mass hoodlums, mass racists, out on the streets really quickly is actually quite frightening. But that's what's going on, Margaret. So there's quite a history to this, and it's been going on for some time.
You said that they said the victim was Scottish when he wasn't, that he was one of them. He was one of them because he was white. And yes, there's this anger about the presence of Black people. You mentioned your National Health Service, and thank God you have such a thing as a National Health Service, and how it depends on immigrant labor, which is could be the subject of a whole other conversation, that there's this brain drain from countries who need nurses and doctors, but they go to the UK, they make more money, they have a better situation, but they're hated because they aren't white. And they are also attacked. There was a story, I think the nurses, they were from Uganda and had just arrived, and they had the place where they were staying was set on fire. They literally left with just the clothes on their backs. And then I thought about Uganda, who needs them, who needs their services. But anyway, it's very complicated, all of the injustices that we're seeing here. But this is, these racists are being supported by people here, at the very top, and I mean that quite literally, by President Donald Trump, by the vice president. There was I believe this young man was killed a few months ago, Stephen Novak.
Yeah.
And he was a white man who was killed by a South Asian man. And the police, in intervening, he had been stabbed. They didn't give him care. He was handcuffed. It was horrible. Now, J.D. Vance, for some reason, Vice President of the United States, has nothing better to do than comment on a criminal case in Britain, saying we've been invaded by people who don't share our values. Trump has talked about migration to Europe. Not only are they using racist policies here, but they're instigating other countries to do likewise. So this is it's international racism, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I find it quite remarkable in so many ways that you have a country where I'm sure the Native Americans said we've been invaded by all of these people who don't share our values and are trying to attack us and take our jobs and take our land and all of this stuff. I'm sure they would say the same. So I find it quite remarkable that goes on, and that they feel that they have the rights to interfere in anybody else's countries and what their policies are. And the fact that we have a National Health Service, as I was saying, that can't be run without migrant workers. We have a social care system that can't be run without migrant workers as well. One of the things that comes with both of those jobs is a whole visa regime that where if you violate these visas that you're on, then you run the risk of being kicked out of the country. Now, one of the things that comes with that, and one of the things that we've reported on in the Morning Star for these migrant workers, just coming over, got all the papers, doing their jobs, but they're tied to an employer. And what we've seen is that some of these employers are engaging in sexual exploitation of these workers as well. Often these workers are tied to accommodation as well. So if they complain about their treatments, then they run the risk of being, whether it's sexual exploitation or labor exploitation, whatever the kind of exploitation, if they complain, they run the risk of being kicked out of the country. And remember, many of these people are bringing children or have children over here, and the children are going into schools, and then run the risk of having to take their kids out of school and stuff. This is something that we've reported on quite extensively. And I think it's quite important in this context as well, because it's one of the reasons why some people won't complain about the treatment that they're getting. And I think it's important that we put in the context of what we're talking about, Margaret, that yes, we've seen this massive kind of violent racist attacks that took place in Belfast and Southampton, and indeed in other places around the country. But it is part of a continual process of racial harassment and racial violence being experienced by Black and brown people in Britain, in all parts of Britain, that is really quite often under the radar because people are not reporting it for fear of losing their status and their right to remain in Britain. I mean, this is a real problem at the moment, and the racists know this as well. You know, and the far right know about these things as well. So they know that quite often they can get away with, as we saw, I don't know if you saw it, Margaret, there was one video shown on social media of a young Black guy who was basically just walking along, sweeping the streets. And some racists came up to him, I think it was in Belfast, came up to him and started harassing him and calling him all sorts of names and telling him to go back home and all of this, and you shouldn't be here, we got no time for you, you're taking our jobs. You know, I mean, taking our jobs, I mean, these are jobs that nobody wants to do quite often. That's why they're over in Britain. So this is part of a pattern that we have in Britain of deep-seated racism that goes way back to my young days of Enoch Powell, which I think we've talked about before, Margaret, of back in 1968, where he was saying, there's too many over here and we need stronger immigration controls, all of this sort of stuff. This goes way back even before my childhood. This goes way back to 1919, the Red Summer of 1919. And if you think about what we saw last week, how close is that to what we saw in what the history books tell us about what happened in 1919 in the US as well, but also in Britain, of Black people being attacked and dragged out of their own homes because we were seen as economic, kind of an economic threat to white people. In those days, it was that they thought we were coming over to take their jobs and women as property, take their women off them. It's all of this sort of nonsense, and it's the same sort of thing that's being resurrected again now. What is great news, though, fantastic news, is the massive turnout of anti-racists that took place on Saturday right the way across Britain. So not just in Belfast, which had the biggest anti-racist rally ever in the history of Northern Ireland. The biggest, I mean, it's huge, with all sorts of speakers and all sorts of communities coming out. I'll say a little bit, maybe in a bit, about the different communities that are involved in this. But we also saw massive demonstrations against the far right, who were also trying to mobilise on Saturday in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, in Brighton, across London, Liverpool. These are big shows of opposition to the far right. But we can't forget, and this is the bit I wanted to come back to, Margaret, about where the majority of these race riots, racial attacks were taking place. And a lot of it was in East Belfast, which is the kind of home of the Democratic Unionist Party, but also in a I think North Belfast as well, which is seen as more kind of so-called alliance region. In West Belfast, where the Republican movement is strong, we saw massive demonstrations, massive support for the anti-racist movements from those areas. So Sinn Féin in particular were brilliant and were showing that they would not put up with this stuff and were marching shoulder to shoulder with anti-racists because they are anti-racist. And I think that it's really important that we acknowledge the role that the paramilitaries are playing in whipping up some of this stuff as well. So they clearly got links to the far right in the US too, which I think we all knew that was the case anyway.
You know, it's interesting to me. There seems to be a lot of angst if the person carrying out violence is Black. Are white people ever violent in Britain? Do they ever commit murders? Does anybody ever have send a mob out if a white person commits the crime? What is the reaction when white people behave this way?
Could you imagine if a white person in US Britain, committed a crime and a load of Black folk came out and demonstrated about it in anything like the same sort of way? What we wouldn't have is the fact that there's only been and I just had a look before we started chatting, and as far as I can see, there's about 20 people that's been arrested so far for what happened in Belfast. Just 20, and mostly kids, right? And you got to think, would that be the same if this was Black people who are standing up? Because when we look back to the kind of Black Lives Matter movement stuff, I mean, they were real quick to arrest any of us who decided to step out of line. 20 people with the kind of scale of the attacks that took place last week have been arrested. That is appalling. And even though Prime Minister Keir Starmer stands up and says they will face the full weight of the law against them, 20 people, hundreds of people is appalling. And you can't help but think that if the boot was on the other foot, whether the same sort of thing would happen. We've raised this thing about, well, what is it? Why is it that the far right as well? What is it that, because the far right are saying that the thing, they're standing up for Black people. They're standing up for white people. They're standing up for women who are attacked by Black people. Basically, apparently, that's all we spend our time doing is attacking people. But when you see all the incidents of white crime in Britain, all the attacks that take place, white person on another white person on a Black person, never the same for all comes up about, well, what is the law doing to protect people? We have to be really clear, and the way that this was reported in the press, Margaret, was really quite instructive, because first of all, none of them in Britain, except us, call this race riots. None of them called it racist, right? And we consistently called it that. And it wasn't until a couple of senior politicians, so Hilary Benn, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, he came out and called it racist, that more politicians and the police actually then started to call it what it was. Sinn Féin called it racist from the beginning, and you got to give credit for them for that. But this is what it was. It was pure and out racism, and we have to foreground that as being what this is all about. So when you start thinking about the different reactions of the authorities to Black and white people committing crimes, we just got to keep in mind that this is what it's all about. It's just about stirring up racism and about enhancing the kind of really horrible atmosphere that exists in Britain at the moment, where many Black people just feel scared to come out of their own homes, never mind at night, but any time of day. Some of those healthcare workers that I was talking about in Belfast, they've come on record as saying they won't even go to work now. They won't even leave to go to work for fear of either being attacked on their way to work or being attacked while they carry out their job as health service workers, right? Or that if they are at work and everything's all right at work, that their houses might be attacked while they're out and all their possessions trashed. So this is a real fear, and it's a fear that I remember from back in the 60s and 70s and stuff when I was growing up, and the kind of attacks that we used to face. But I think that I haven't seen anything of this ferocity in my lifetime, for sure.
And you mentioned Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the Reform Party. And it seems immigration, or being opposed to immigration, is their main platform. Am I right?
Yeah, they don't seem to have anything else, really.
And is it possible for him to become prime minister? What do you think about that?
It's entirely possible, actually. The opinion polls have Reform UK running very high, if not leading, then second in the opinion polls. And I think again we have to look at what's going on here in the same way that we should look at the kind of not anti, but the kind of xenophobic kind of environments that have been created around the world. So when we look at South Africa, for example, and the kind of xenophobic marches that are taking place there, it's no accident, I think, that all of these things are taking place at the same time. People are getting funded to do it. And I raise that comparison because it's about saying Farage is clearly getting his money from the United States, really big donors, and there's a big furore about him being given £5 million, and it's not clear about where he's got the money from, and is avoiding doing any TV or radio interviews of any kind, and he's just gone underground basically, which is a bit weird because there's a big by-election taking place tomorrow, and you'd think that the leader of that party would appear in front of the media, but he's not. So he's a dodgy character, to say the least, but also he's getting his funding from this kind of cabal, I suppose, of ultra right-wing donors from the States, but also India as well. That a lot of the money's coming from there. It's really not as clear as black and white, because we can see that some of the big supporters of Reform UK are part of this Hindu nationalist stuff as well. So part of that Modi kind of group of people as well. And they're really clear that they're part of that as well. There's actually a small group who are Sikhs for Reform UK as well, which is even weirder for me. So there's a really weird kind of coalition of people going on here. But the thing that they have in common, I suppose, is money. And it's really about where the rich feel that they can fund their political ambitions by taking advantage of working class communities across Britain. That's essentially what's going on. Tommy Robinson, who I mentioned, gets masses of funding. He was arrested. He came back from Russia this week and was arrested on terrorism charges at Heathrow Airport. And the first thing he did, which is well, he clearly didn't do it himself, because he was in jail and his phone had been confiscated off him, but somebody on his behalf then put out an appeal for funds for his legal case, which it hadn't even been said what he was going to face a proper legal case yet. But this is what he does all the time. And Farage, they're money making people. They're after feathering their own nests, and this is what they do. So yeah, it's entirely possible that Farage might get enough votes to be prime minister, but it's even more probable, I think, that people in Britain will rise up and organise and stop that from happening.
And is immigration, it seems to be, like here in the US, it's something that many white people are obsessed with, but what are living conditions like for them? And what I mean is Britain has impoverished its people with neoliberal policies, deindustrialized like the US did, giving money to Ukraine while there are people in need. Does anybody protest that? Or is it just anger at brown people being in the country?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question because I don't remember the figures, but the levels of poverty in Britain are really, really high. And instead of saying, well, it's there's a load of people who are getting richer and richer while we get poorer and poorer, while we're struggling to keep a roof over our heads, while we're struggling to get jobs, instead of saying that that's where the problem is, the message that comes out, and again, we've all seen this before. Everybody watching this, I'm sure, has seen this before. The message that is going out is this is the case because of all of these black and brown people being in Britain and taking your jobs, and that's why we have to do this thing. They talk about stopping the boats all the time coming across the English Channel because that they just bring in all of these sponges on our society, basically, in inverted commas, and these people need to be stopped because they're not only threatening our way of life as English people or Scottish people or Welsh people or Northern Irish people. This is not the same, I don't think, in the Republic of Ireland. But not only is that the case, but they're also taking our homes and taking our jobs and so on. So and to enable them to construct that argument, they've got the moneyed media to help them to do that. They've got the corporate media that really helps to push out those messages. And very little on things like the BBC that helps to push back against those sorts of lies, really. Because at the same time as white working class people are struggling to survive, black working class people are struggling to survive. And the biggest issue for us is how we create that working class movement of black and white people that's going to come together to be able to stand up and really make the case for radical change that's required in our society. But as I said, the way that they're able to construct the arguments so that we're not able to be able to do that. The trade union movement in Britain is, as we've put on some numbers apparently in the trade union movement, but I think it's minimal really in the scheme of things. When I left school in 1979, it was 13 million in the trade union movement here. It's now less than 6 million. So this is huge. These are huge numbers, huge differences. And without a working class movement, then those people, I think, are going to continue to be susceptible to arguments about somebody else is to blame, rather than actually there's people making loads of money in Britain who refuse to pay their taxes, while we have to make sure that we can just survive from day to day. And so I do think that there's a need to look at what is it that we can do to build that working class unity that's going to make a difference.
So tell our viewers where they can find your work and find Morning Star.
All right, you can find the Morning Star online. I know you can't get it, the paper edition, in the United States and in most bits of the world, but you can still get it in Britain. So if you're watching this in Britain, please do buy and subscribe to the Morning Star. Yeah, and you can find us online as well, where everything that's in the print edition is online as well. I'm the international editor of the paper, so all the we do write extensively about the challenges that are facing working class and peasant communities across the globe, and what is it that we can do collectively to try and build opposition. So you can see a lot of my work there. You can see a lot of my work on People's Dispatch as well, in Carney Books, in Carney Book Review, which has just started. That's another place where my work is, and the People's World as well publishes some of my work as well.
Morningstaronline.co.uk.
That's the one.
All right. Thank you so much, Roger.
No problem at all. Anytime.
And that was Roger McKenzie from Morning Star UK, discussing the recent racist mob attacks taking place in Britain.